So welcome to our next EB-5 live session. So today we're going to talk about project selection, what to look for, how does the project selection process work, which projects are good for you, which ones to watch out for. And I'm very grateful for those of you who have been rewatching these lives after the fact. So obviously, if you join the live session, you can ask questions and I'll try to answer these questions right away. But the reason why we're doing these live sessions on YouTube is because we are saving them. This way, you can always rewatch it later. And I know that many of you have actually been rewatching these videos. So I'm glad to continue to create this content, kind of like a library of different EB-5 content. All right, so project selection and how it works. So as many of you know, EB-5, to apply for an EB-5 investor visa, you must invest into a qualifying project. A qualifying project can be either through the direct EB-5 program or through the regional center program. Direct EB-5 requires investment in your own company, but it also requires a creation of 10 full-time W-2 employee jobs. So buying a business and counting those jobs doesn't help. You actually have to create 10 new W-2 salaried employees, which is why the direct program has not become very popular. You know, it still represents less than 5% of all EB-5 visa petitions. Why? Because the vast majority of entrepreneurs or international investors either do not have the time, the skill set, or the ability to start a business from scratch, the kind of business that will require 10 full-time new jobs, right? So it's very narrow. The regional center on the other program allows investors to pull together their funds with a bunch of other EB-5 investors and finance large projects. So what's nice about the regional center program is it does not require the day-to-day operation from the investor himself. So you're able to pick one of the larger projects, place your money there, and there's an actual management company that runs the operation, builds the project. They're the ones creating all the jobs, and you as an investor get credit for it because you provided financing to them. And the nice thing about the regional center EB-5 also is that the regional centers get privileges. They get to count all indirectly created jobs, not just the ones that were directly created. So they can count W-2s, but they can also count 1099s. They can count pretty much any job indirectly created by the project, whether it's a construction job, service job, or even vendors who are supplying, services to the finished project. So as a result, the EB-5 Regional Center program obviously has become much more popular and much more noticeable, and it's just useful. So that poses a different question. When you're picking an EB-5 project, what do we look for? Because as an investor, it's important to understand that investing through an EB-5 regional center is not by any way, shape, or form guaranteed by the government. The US government gives you total freedom. You can invest in whatever projects you want, but that also puts total responsibility on you. You have to do your own project due diligence. You have to do a risk assessment to understand, and basically you're responsible for your own investment funds. Sounds awesome, but in reality, that's a really big burden to put on investors who are often not professional investors, right? So some of you may come from finance, and you may be able to look at these projects and analyze their financial statements, read their contracts, and come out with your own conclusion. But the reality is most of you are not coming from this background. So how do you navigate what to look for? Back in the day when EB-5 just started to become popular, there were no licensed professionals who specialized in analyzing EB-5 deals and advising clients through these transactions, right? So investors were really left to their own devices. They would have to look at these project documents, maybe retain a professional such as a securities attorney or CPA to help them analyze some of these deals. but that work fell on the investor. Today, there are licensed FINRA brokers who specialize in analyzing EB-5 projects. They put them through their own independent due diligence process, and then they advise clients about which projects to consider or not. And I'm one of those brokers. That has been my specialty for the last few years. Prior to that, I was an immigration attorney specializing in EB-5 investor petitions for over a decade. So, of course, I use my experience on the legal side in this industry as part of my analysis. And I have an entire due diligence team at the FINRA licensed broker dealer, and that due diligence team comes together to do due diligence on these projects. So, common questions. What do we look for in a project? First and foremost, I always look at the regional center experience, because what's important to understand in EB-5 projects, you have a developer. That's the company that usually buys the land, puts the initial capital together, designs the renderings of the projects, gets all the permits, they build the building, and they operate it. That's the real estate developer. The regional center, on the other hand, is usually a totally separate entity. That's the entity that pulls together all the different EB-5 funds and then loans them to the developer or gives credit to the developer. The regional center has to be licensed by USCIS, so they have to have special permissions, and they have to know all the USCIS EB-5 requirements, so they can communicate to the developer changes that are allowed under the program and changes that are not allowed under the program. They also have to collect all the documents from the developer, the construction process, expenditure reports, so that they can report everything properly to USCIS and really prove to USCIS that this project qualifies for the program and creates enough jobs. So the regional center does have a big responsibility. If the regional center is inexperienced, or if the developer simply rents a license of a regional center and tries to manage that process themselves, they may not know what's going on, because EB-5 compliance is complicated and it changes all the time. So they may miss certain filings, they may miss certain reports, they may not realize they're supposed to be collecting certain documents from their subcontractors. And then you, as an investor, if you invested with, let's say, an experienced developer, but inexperienced regional center, you may find yourself in a situation where you spend the money, the project was built, but you are not getting your green card because they didn't report the job creation appropriately. Or maybe they made some changes to the project as it was getting built, and USCIS deems those changes material changes, again, rendering you ineligible for the green card. So the regional center experience is super important, because that's what gives you really high certainty that the documents are going to be timely and appropriately delivered to USCIS, accounting for all the work that the project is supposed to do and all the compliance with EB-5 requirements. So that's first thing that we look at when we look at a project. Regional center experience, how good they are with reporting, how they've treated their investors previously. So having been in this industry for now almost 15 years, since 2012, it's 14 years, you get to see a lot of different things. So that becomes very important. Second is the developer experience. Same thing. If this person is building a building, they're designing, they're managing, they're operating, you want to make sure they've done this before. Ideally, you want to make sure this developer has done this before multiple times and is either very familiar with the general industry. So if they're building a hospital, they know they've built other hospitals before, or with this particular area. So if they're building in Dallas, you want to make sure that they have experience in that market, right? So we look at the developer, their background, how much money they're contributing to the project. Then what's next? So say you have an experienced regional center, an experienced developer. Does that guarantee success? No, because sometimes very smart, experienced developers want to put all the risk on the investors. They're smart, they've been around the block a few times. The way they structure these deals is so that they can build and sort of risk the investor's money instead of risking their own money. And that's where this next step is super important. You look at the capital stack of the project. How much money, what is their budget, and where's that money coming from? How much money is the developer contributing? How much money are they borrowing from a bank? How much money are you contributing as an EB-5 investor? And you want to see the order. Who's first in line? First lien position, second lien position, third lien position. Are EB-5 investors first to get repaid or second or last? So a lot of investors early in the EB-5 kind of industry used to ask me, well, when I invest in a project, can I own a part of this project? Can I be, what they're saying is, can I be an equity investor? Same as the developer. I own part of the deal, which means I can possibly make a return if this project is profitable. The problem with an equity position in the project, yes, it is true that you are eligible to make money if the project makes money, but that's also usually the riskier financial position, meaning if the project doesn't make money, you are the first in line to lose your capital, because if the project is sold for less money than it was built for, that capital is going to go first to repay the lenders who are in the first and second lien position, and only after that it goes to repay whatever is left for the equity holders. So general equity positions tend to be higher risk. That's why we don't see that many of them anymore in EB-5. So number one, higher risk on the principal generally, and number two, no set time to repay. Because if you are a co-owner, say, of a hotel along with the developer, that's great. Now you own a teeny tiny fraction of this entire hotel. The hotel is operating, making some money. The developer doesn't want to sell it. So what do you do if you want to get your money back in 5 or 6 years? You own a tiny share, so you can't force the developer to sell. So you end up being stuck sometimes. If the developer wants to own this property for the next 10 years, you're stuck there with them without being able to regain your capital. And so when we look at the capital stack, that's what we look for. Debt, which position of debt, if it's equity, preferred equity has a specific payout plan, a timeline usually, but general equity, typically we don't want to be in that position. Okay, so the next question is about capital stack. Sometimes the capital stack looks beautiful. It says developers contributing 40% of the project budget, and the rest, 60%, is coming from EB-5 investors. Just because something is beautiful in the marketing brochure or the initial brochure does not mean you can relax. You need to read the actual documents and the contracts, because their marketing brochure can show you plan A, but their contracts may say that they can divert from plan A if necessary. So I'll give you an example. Sometimes they market and they say the developers producing 40% equity. I want to make sure our live is not interrupted, because we had some messages coming in. But say they say they're going to contribute 40% equity from the developer. EB-5 investors will contribute 60, and EB-5 investors are in the first lien position. It sounds awesome. It sounds like, okay, you're building a project for 100 million, you're putting in 40, we're putting in 60, and when the project is sold, we are the first in line to get repaid. So it seems very safe, right? You would have to spend 100 million on this project and mess it up so badly that it gets sold for basically half the value, and we're still repaid because the first 60 million is going to go to us. But you need to look at what the documents say and how much money was actually put in today, because sometimes they will say 40% from developers, 60 from investors, but they want the investor to put their money in first, and they haven't really spent any money yet, right? So now You're the one spending 60 million, and if the project is going up in the construction, then it's time for the developer to start their equity contribution, and they don't have the money because maybe they were expecting to sell something, or they were expecting to raise equity from regular investors and they didn't raise the money. So now your money is in dirt, your money finishes most of the construction, but you don't have the rest of it. So not great. Or another alternative could be they start construction process, they didn't spend all your money yet, construction prices go up due to economic changes, tariffs, and so on. All of a sudden, the developer says, forget that. The economy has changed. Finishing this project is not going to yield a profit. I'm not going to drop my 40 million in a project that's no longer going to be profitable. So we're canceling the project. So they can return the money that hasn't been spent, but now you don't have a green card, and now some of the money that did get spent on a piece of dirt, you're just trying to recoup it, and it's going to be very hard to sell it for the same amount of money. So when we're looking at the capital stack, we want to see not only the stack and the positions for everybody, but how much money did the developer already put in, and did they secure, if they have to take a loan, did they secure this loan? Meaning, do they actually have an agreement with the bank? Did they get fully approved for it? Or is there just a letter of intent from a bank? If it's just a letter of intent, that means they may still not qualify for the final loan. So it may make sense for investors to wait before they give their money to that project. And of course, as I mentioned, you look in the documents, because the document has a plan A, plan B, plan C. I'll give you an example. The capital stack may say 40% equity from developers, 60 from EB-5 investors. But the document may say, in case the developer cannot raise 40% equity from their partners, they're allowed to take out a senior loan and put it in front of the investors. So they can get senior loan up to 30%, then 60% from EB-5 investors, and the developer only has to put in 10. Changes the whole dynamic, right? Because now they're putting a bank loan ahead of you in the position. So without reading the documents, without seeing this plan A, plan B, plan C, you don't really know what this project is doing if you only read their marketing material. Again, that's part of the work that we do as broker-dealers, so we can discuss these options and the potential changes with the investors to make sure that they are acceptable to the investor. So capital stack, super important. And then where are they in construction? Did they get all the necessary permits? Did they pass all the requirements? Did they already start construction? I obviously love it when we can go into a project that's well along the way in construction. This means the construction risks, the risks of delay are reduced. So of course, when we can go into a project that's like 60, 70% finished, that's awesome, because we're still financing real construction jobs that are occurring at the end. At the same time, a lot of the financial risks, the risks of delay, are eliminated already. So construction process matters. And then what are they building? You know, is it another luxury apartment in Miami? How much can the market sustain it? Or is it a hospital in an area where there was already a shortage? So the demand for the asset and how economically viable this asset is through different economic cycles is also important. I'll give you an example. Office spaces, they tend to lose a lot of tenants in a bad economy. So an office building can be extremely profitable in a good economy, right? Profit margins are higher than, for example, hotels or apartments. But every few years when we have an economic slowdown, people move out of their offices. People don't easily move out of their apartments. You know, hospitals don't get shut down just because the economy is bad. People are still getting sick and they still go to the hospitals. But a lot of companies reduce the size of the office space they use. They lay off workers, and, you know, they just give up their office space. So there are certain asset classes that are a little bit more prone to economic risk, right? So if you're going into an office space building, you want to look at their financials to make sure they can ride out that economy. An apartment complex, on the other hand, generally speaking, is more profitable, right? So, in a sense, or I would say not even more profitable, but it may be less profitable, but it's more recession proof. People who rent, even when the economy is bad, you tend to not give up your primary residence. So people who are renting places, they usually don't move out of their apartment just because the economy is bad, right? So apartment complexes tend to hold their occupancy rates pretty high even when the recession hits. They may lose some tenants, some people will move in back with their family, but not the majority of tenants. Let's see. So we looked at the capital stack, we looked at the experience of the developer in the regional center, we looked at the construction timelines, we looked at the asset class. I personally like to visit the projects that I look at. And guys, this is the part where you learn all sorts of surprising things. Sometimes we receive documents for a project and it looks amazing. It looks like it's going to be a hitter, it's well-structured project, great, great company is developing it. And then you go and you do a site visit and you realize like, oh, they didn't tell me that, two other very similar projects are coming up down the street. That's going to really dilute the market, right? So there may have an oversupply of 4-star hotels. Or they didn't tell me that, there's an environmental issue down the block. So when I get to go and visit these projects, I like to interview not just the individuals who are managing this particular facility or building this, but I actually like to venture out and interview other developers who live in the area, people who live in the area, who are like either working there or have businesses, because you learn a lot. You learn that there's an environmental lawsuit down the street or some other changes, and sometimes you learn surprisingly negative things that may impact that entire area, and sometimes you learn surprisingly positive things that make you realize that the project you looked at, it actually seems like a much more solid deal given, for example, market demand or the growth in the area. Like you may arrive and realize, okay, there's a $2 billion development taking place down the street and they have a shortage of hotels. And so site visits are, I think, really helpful in gaining a general understanding in what's going on economically in that region. Fun fact, I also find that a lot of times when you speak to the regional centers, you're speaking to one of their sales representatives. And they're good at their job and they tell you a lot of great things about their project. But a lot of times when you do a site visit, you typically do a site visit not with a salesperson, with a construction manager, with, someone who works at the site. And they tend they sometimes will tell you very honest things without thinking twice. They will tell you about a problem they're trying to solve or delays they're dealing with. They'll complain about the city ordinance. And that kind of gives you more honest, sometimes feedback into potential delays or issues. So site visits, I think, are great as well as a tool. So let's see. Those are kind of the general things. We as brokers also look at the team. We look at the principals, who are the main investors, who are the developers, who has control over the project. And we do kind of this bad actors check to see, did this person have SEC violations previously? Did they have negative lawsuits where people have sued them for fraud? You kind of want to also rule out actors who have previously had problems out of the ones that you're now working with. So when we look at all of that, I always say investment, you can never fully eliminate the investment risk. Even when you put your money in a bank, there's no guarantee that bank will not fail, right? You have FDIC insurance in the United States. If that bank fails, you get at least some of your money back by the federal government, but that's why we even have insurance, right? Because banks can fail. But depending on how much money you have in the account, if you have more money than FDIC covers, you may not see that money back. You put the money in the checking account and then you can't get it back. Obviously, in the US, banks fail very rarely. That's why we feel like a checking account is safe, but it has happened. And it's happened, in 2008. And so fairly recently. So I always say money always is at risk somewhere. And when we're making an investment decision, we cannot fully eliminate all risks. Like nobody could have predicted COVID and how it would impact certain sectors. But the goal is by reviewing and doing a deep due diligence on these projects is eliminating risks that are already obvious. Like if you're investing with someone who has pending lawsuits in other projects and investors are accusing them of mismanaging funds, probably not a good idea. This person is probably not great at doing this organization. And I cannot tell you how many people do end up in these situations where they just simply don't Google the individuals that they're working with. Another thing is if you're investing in a project where it states in the documents that you may be in the first lien position, but in reality, they're allowed to take out the loan and replace you and put a big bank loan in front of you. That bank will have first rights and to collect their principal and interest. Also not a great idea. These are risks that can and should be eliminated, and this is something that we strive to do beforehand. So those are kind of the main things to look for in an EB-5 project. I will never give a green light to any particular industry. I'm not going to tell you all apartment complexes are always safer than office space. No, depends on the deal. You may have a crappy apartment complex deal and you may have a great office space position that you're getting. I will never say rural is more risky than urban because, again, there are plenty of risky urban deals and plenty of rural deals that have eliminated a lot of the risks typically associated with building in a less dense area. Same with regional centers. As much as I think some of these entities have earned a great reputation and have had a lot of good deals, the reality is it's business. Each regional center, each project is different. Just because a regional center had one deal that was especially strong when we were looking at their deal with investors, doesn't mean their next deal is going to be just as strong, right? Because I'll give you a simple example, this kind of from real life. There is a regional center that at one point, one of their projects was one of my favorite projects ever that we have seen in the market. Why? By the time we were investing with our investors, the project has already been in the market for 2 years. It already received USAS approvals. It already was built because the developer was putting in the money first. And then they had a bridge loan, so a temporary loan they started building with that we were coming in and replacing. So by the time we looked at this deal, like by the time we were ready to invest, the building was built, it's an apartment complex, it was already 90% leased out. So we didn't have to wonder if people wanted to live in this building. Not only was it 90% leased out, they were actually charging higher rents than they originally anticipated because this building turned out so beautiful and people wanted to live there. They created all the necessary construction jobs already. And as I mentioned, USAS has already reviewed them and approved them. So, and all the other money, all the bank loans and all the developer equity were in. So that was, and they still had a few spots left. So my investors took some of those last spots. We were super happy. This was a good transaction for them, right? Reduced the risks by a lot. Their next deal is different because their next deal is just coming out. So there's a hole in the ground. That's all there is. The building is not 90% built. They just structured their next deal and it's similar to the first project, except it's 2 years earlier, right? There's just a hole in the ground. The developer is just starting to contribute their cash. They just filed their documents with USCIS, so we don't have an approval yet. They just, they just applied for the bank loan. They have not secured it. The bank has not issued them the money yet. And it's just early, so things can still happen in the construction cycle, and they're not going to start leasing out the building until 2 years from now. Although we think it's going to do well based on how their other properties did before, but we don't know for sure. So this is why I don't ever greenlight one regional center, right? Same regional center, but different projects at different stages. So I will never say this regional center, hands down, you can pick any of those deals. And that's why I like being an independent broker. I don't have to stick with one regional center. If today this regional center has a better deal, we're able to take advantage of it. Tomorrow, someone else has a stronger deal, we're able to go into that deal. So obviously, we want the regional center to be ethical and experienced, and we like to pick out of those top guns, but every deal is going to be a little bit different, and we want to look at the specifics of your project. All right, well, thank you guys for being a captive audience. I hope today's session was helpful, and I didn't see any questions, so I hope my explanation was clear. Stay tuned, come back next week for another live session. We do this every Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and I'm happy to share more information. Oh, also, if you have topic ideas for next live sessions that you want us to discuss, send us a message or leave a comment on this video. Thanks, and share this with anybody that you think it's going to be useful for. Thank you.